am Tamara, and today we are making these adorable little book bags or purses, however you want to call them. I think they are just super cute, made with this gingham fabric from Michael Miller, and I think that they are a great summer project. And the reason why I like to call it a book bag is because I think it is the perfect size for a chapter book. So I'm going to be gifting these books to my nieces this summer, and they will be able to easily just throw an adorable little chapter book in there, take it on a picnic or wherever they want to go, take it to grandma's house, and there you go. You've got your book bag, you've got your chapter book with you. You can do notebooks, pens and paper in here, take it to church on Sunday so that they have something to do in the service. So many different ways that you can use this adorable book bag. I also have a printed version in the description down below for you, as well as everything else that I use in this tutorial will be linked in the description down below as well. So check that out. Now let's get on to the tutorial. To make this adorable bag, you will need 3 fat quarters. 1 fat quarter you will put aside, and we will use that for our ruffle later on. The other 2 fat quarters, you will use one as the outer fabric and one as your lining. Take those 2 fabrics and just stack them on top of each other. And then cut out 2 rectangles at 12 inches by 9.5 inches. So you will end up with 2 of your lining fabric and 2 of your outer fabric when doing this. Next, we want to round off 2 of the corners on all 4 of these fabrics. So again, just stack all 4 on top of each other. Grab something that allows you to trace a curve on both of those corners. For myself, I just used this children's IKEA cup here. And then I just grabbed a water-soluble marker and I traced around that cup on 2 corners that are on the short edge of the fabric. So both of those points are along the 9.5 inch edge. And trim away both of those corners. For myself, I did add pins into the fabric to stop them from shifting while I was trimming away those edges. Next, it's time to prepare the 3rd fat quarter for the ruffle and the wrist strap. Take your fat quarter and cut 3 strips at 4.5 inches wide by the width of the fabric. So you will end up with 3 long strips and then a little scrap at the edge. Take that little scrap and put it aside. We will use that for our wrist strap later on. But right now we want to prep our ruffle. So take all 3 4.5 strips that you cut and sew them together end to end with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then press those seams open. And while we are still at our iron, we will take this strip and fold it wrong sides together and then press along that edge, creating a nice strip of fabric for our ruffle. Now, before you put that iron away completely, you will take both of those short edges and actually fold them in 1/4 inch, press, and then fold in half, press again, and then sew along that outer edge, creating a nice finished edge on both short sides. Now, making the ruffle is probably the most time-consuming part of this whole project, so be patient with yourself. We now need to turn this strip of fabric into our ruffle, and I have a very detailed tutorial on how you can do this, which I will link in the description down below. But for the sake of this video, I will just say that you need to sew 2 very long basting stitches across the raw edge of your ruffle, making sure not to crisscross those stitches. So a basting stitch is essentially the longest stitch your sewing machine will allow you to make, and then you will work your way from one end to the other end, and sometimes you can work your way from both ends towards the middle, just slowly pulling along that basting stitch. And by doing this, you are creating your ruffle. Now, don't get too upset if one of your basting stitches snaps, especially if this is the first time that you've done this. That's why we sewed 2 basting stitches, to make sure that we have that secondary option just in case one of your threads snap. By the end, your ruffle should be 31.5 inches long. And if you are enjoying this tutorial, please hit that thumbs up button and hit that subscribe button so you don't lose me on YouTube. I try to post new tutorials every Friday. Next, we need to cut out 2 strips of fabric from our fat quarter scraps. The longer strip of fabric will be our wrist strap strap, and that should come from the leftover ruffle fabric. And then the smaller loop will be what holds our wrist strap, and that fabric should come from our lining fabric. Cut the wrist strap at 3 inches by 20 inches, and cut your smaller loop at 3 inches by 6 inches. Then it's time to add our medium weight interfacing to all of our pieces. You will add it to the wrist strap, as well as to that smaller loop, and to your 2 outer pieces of fabric. I will link to the interfacing that I used in the description down below. Make sure to follow the interfacing's instructions that you purchased to make sure that you are adding it to your fabric correctly. One more thing to note about interfacing, it is important to do this step correctly and really make sure that your interfacing is attached properly. This will stop your fabric from having bubbles within it later on. Now it's time to prepare the wrist strap and the smaller loop. With the interfacing already attached, finger press the 2 long edges in 1/4 of an inch, and then fold the piece of fabric in half, finger pressing again. Then clip along that one edge, and then sew 1/8 of an inch seam around all 4 edges. Do this for the wrist strap as well. Now that we have prepped all of our pieces for our adorable book bag, it's time to finally put all of these pieces together. The final step of prep is to just take your ruffle and trim away all of those excess threads. Then grab one of your outer panels and lay it right side up, and start laying your ruffle with the raw edges lined up, making sure that the ruffle starts 3/4 of an inch down from the top edge of the panel. You will go all the way around, and you will end leaving that same 3/4 inch space. And when you get to the rounded corner, you'll also want to make sure that you tuck your ruffle in, so that when you end up sewing along this edge, you don't end up sewing some of the ruffle in incorrectly. So I like to just tuck it all up into the center, and I'll even grab a secondary pin to hold it in place out of the way. When you get to the opposite end, make sure you're leaving that 3/4 inch space. This is where you may need to adjust your ruffle a little bit, which is why you really don't want to tie a knot in your basting threads before this point. As you can see here, I'm finally tying a knot in my basting stitch because I now know that it is the correct length. Now you can finally trim away those basting threads before laying the other outer panel right side face down on top of this ruffle, and then I just adjust the clips so that they are holding all 3 layers together. Next, take your 2 lining pieces of fabric and lay them right sides together as well. Then take 2 pins and mark a 4-inch opening along the bottom edge of that lining. Then sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance around the outer edge of our outer fabric, starting and stopping with a back stitch, and do not sew across that top edge. For our lining fabric, we will sew a 3/4 inch seam allowance, starting at one edge and ending at one of our pins, then start at the other pin and go all the way to that top edge. The section between the pins is the section that we will need later on to turn our project right side out. Again, remember to backstitch when you start and when you stop. Now, to make our lining fabric smoother when we turn it right side out, we just want to trim away a little bit of the corners. So you'll just snip in little triangle pieces, taking out a little bit of that excess fabric. That will help it once it's turned right side out. For the outer fabric, the one with the interfacing attached, I actually just took a pair of scissors and trimmed away the excess seam allowance so that it sat at around 1/4 of an inch all the way around. I found this was the easiest way to make sure that that edge, when turned right side out, will also look nice and crisp. Then take the lining fabric to the iron and just press those outer edges open. So this is what your lining and outer fabric should look like at this point. Now we need to add our smaller loop into the mix. So grab your smaller strip of fabric that we prepared earlier, fold it so that you end up with a bit of a point at the top. You don't want it to be an actual triangle point though. You need a 1-inch space in between that fold at the top. Then we need to take this loop and tuck it inside our outer fabric. So first what I'll do is take the top of our outer fabric and I'll measure so that I know the exact center for this little loop. You will center this loop between the two outer edges, but you also want to make sure that the loop is measuring in 3/4 of an inch. This way it will lay nice and snug to the top of your bag when everything is said and done. And then pin it in place. So it's at this point that while filming, I did this step a little bit differently. So I just want to show you here, this is what I mean by folding the wristband. You want to fold it properly and then you'll tuck it in. I'll show you the images so that you can follow along. But I just want you to know that when I say fold the wrist strap, I literally mean fold it right in half. Then take your wrist strap, fold it in half and center it on the opposite side and pin it in place as well, leaving it sticking out about 1/2 inch. Here you can see that I did not fold my loop in half. Ignore that. I decided folding it in half is better, so I've inserted a photo here for you to follow. Now it's time to take this to your sewing machine and sew across that top edge, remembering to do a back stitch when you start and when you stop, securing both straps in place. Now it's time to attach our lining to our outer fabric. So take your lining and turn it right side out and just gently press out those edges with your fingers. Next, take your lining and tuck it nicely inside your outer fabric. Line up the two side seams, making sure to tuck the ruffle out of the way, then pin around the entire top edge, securing the lining and the outer fabric together before taking it to your sewing machine and sewing a 1/2 inch seam around the entire top, starting with a back stitch and stopping with a back stitch. An extra tip for this step would be to go slowly over the thicker sections. And if you find your sewing machine is struggling, then switch to a jean sewing needle and that will help as well. And this is what it should look like once you've sewn that seam. Now we will pull the lining on out and turn our entire project right side out. Now, because you are working with interfacing, it's going to be a bit stiff. The easiest way that I found to do this is to reach on in and grab both corners in your hand, and that will allow you to gently turn the interfaced portion right side out much easier without causing too many extra wrinkles. Gently press it flat with your hands, pulling on the ruffles to get those two round corners out all the way. And then sew a seam across that opening that is still in your lining before tucking your lining on into the outer fabric. Now grab your sewing clips or pins and pin around the entire top edge, rolling the lining down with your fingers so that you're making sure the lining is not sticking out above the outer fabric. Then you will sew a 1/2 inch seam across that top edge from ruffle edge to ruffle edge, turn it over and do the same on the opposite side, remembering to backstitch when you start and when you stop. Now, if you're super observant, you will notice that my wrist strap is not where it is supposed to be, where I told you to put it, where I showed you that image earlier. And that is because I fixed this later on when I realized that this method did not work. As you can see here, I now have the wrist strap in the correct spot, the spot that I told you to put it, and it works so nice. It tucks beautifully into that loop, and you end up with an adorable little book bag or purse, however you want to use it. So I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial sewing your very own book bag. Please hit that subscribe button so you don't lose me on YouTube, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.